Hey listeners and supporters to J.B. Shreve and the End of History, just a little heads up on this episode and actually the next 6 episodes that will be hitting your podcast feed in the coming days. 2 episodes a week over the next 3 weeks. This is actually a rebroadcast of an old series that I did in the lead up to the elections in 2016. It's a 6-part podcast series on the history of the religious right, or the history of the Christian right. Now, you'll notice there's some dated references in a few of these episodes that pertain specifically to the 2016 elections, and some content from the website, theendofhistory.net, which we had up at that time. Just disregard all that, okay? Why am I releasing this podcast, or re-releasing this podcast series right now, though? There's a couple of reasons. First, if you've purchased my latest book, Politically Incorrect, Real Faith in an Era of Unreal Politics, you'll notice that the research that went into this podcast series also shaped the background of a couple of chapters in that book. So I really want politically engaged Christians to understand the origins of their political involvement, both biblically and philosophically. Then the second reason is because we're coming up on an election year, 2024. My money says 2024 is going to be an election year like no other. We thought we saw crazy, we saw chaos in 2020. Just wait. Because of that, it's really important that believers know where they stand and what they stand for. Don't get caught up in the hype. Don't get deceived. If you haven't purchased your copy of the new book yet, please do that today. I think it's one of the most important books you'll read in the next year. And maybe I'm a little biased, but so be it. In any event, enjoy this reposting of the history of the religious right without bias, without prejudice, and with respect. Thanks for listening, everyone.
This is the end of history.
A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies.
We believe that peace is at hand.
An axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Democracy and freedom for all. We must choose in this crucial moment of human history.
Okay, so welcome to this special podcast series from the End of History. If you're familiar with our website and the podcast, then you know this series, this episode is part of an overall focus on American politics leading up to the elections in November. That's not typically what we solely focus on there at the End of History, but for it's going on for 30 days is when we started. From now up until the time of the election, that is what we're focusing on with this special None of the Above series is what it's called. You can learn more about that at the website, theendofhistory.net. Specifically, we're focusing on the Christian perspectives, the Christian values, and how they relate to this election. Because of that, I wanted to do this series because I think it's really central to understanding why Americans, and especially American Christians, think the way they do about politics today. Now, before I get into this story, and I really enjoyed researching this story. I really enjoyed researching the history on this, all the different reading I had to do to get what the final product you're going to get to listen to in this podcast series. It's a very interesting topic from my perspective, and I hope you'll find that as well. But before I get into that, I want to establish some ground rules to kind of let you know where I'm coming from. 10 years ago, I would have considered myself part of the Christian right, or the religious right, depending on which, both of them are basically the same thing, what you're looking for there. Outsiders looking in today would probably still consider me part of the Christian right, although I personally don't consider myself that anymore. And I say that, I've kind of identifying my background, not because it's necessarily relevant to the story of the history of the Christian or religious right. I say it because as best as possible, I want this to be an honest account of the history on this topic. Now, there's a lot of stuff out there on the history of the religious right, and a lot of that stuff, as far as I can tell, is not really very honest. It's not very historical. It's not very accurate. For example, depending on which book or which article you draw from, you'll think that the history of the religious right has its origins either in big corporate business or racist political policies. And that just isn't true. Those interests did overlap at times over the course of this history, but that's not really the story of the history of the religious right. Those kinds of things, the big corporate stuff, the racist political policies, things like that, those are more like a paragraph and a long volume of history of the religious right, and they don't tell the whole story really. So when it's relevant, I'm going to cover those things in the story, but I'm not focusing on them. If that's not really the focus, that doesn't really make any sense to me. I want to tell a fair history because to be honest, most of this, at least in the beginning and most of the way throughout the history of the religious right, it's really a story about good people trying to help society and the world out. That's what it was. It was about good intentions that, from what I can tell, and I think most people listening would agree by the time we get to the end of this thing, those good intentions, they got hijacked along the way. So this is an honest look at the religious right without prejudice and without an agenda necessarily. No greater agenda than just trying to find a true story, okay? Also recognize I'm not going to get into a lot of the theology that supported these folks, okay? That theology was different at different points in the story, and it was pretty interesting in its own right, but I'm not really going to take the time to go down those rabbit trails. One of the things I will do, for those who are interested, I'll post a kind of bibliography at the website today. This will be a show notes page that lists some of the books, some of the articles and websites I utilized in researching the topic, researching the history and the story that I'm telling. So if you want to look more at the theology, then that post would be a good start for you personally to go and check out. Be aware that most of these sources that I'm going to be listing, they're not Christian sources. They're skeptical sources. My preference in researching stuff, whether it's the Christian right or anything else, is to go and look at what people who I don't agree with, what they're saying about it, and then see if I can unwrap their perspectives to get to the truth. Plus, I kind of grew up on the perspectives of the Christian right in my own right. So I kind of already had that background knowledge to some extent, some degree. Last up, before we get into our story, I will reserve a lot of my own thoughts, my own perspectives, as much as possible until the final episode in this series. If things go as planned, we're going to have 5 episodes to cover this history. Now, those episodes are going to be released in the course of the next 10 days, so this isn't going to be a long, drawn-out thing. Episode 5, it'll conclude with some considerations about the religious right in American politics and the role of Christian faith and values in general in regards to politics. Values and faith, which is largely absent from the 2016 election, if you've been paying any attention. It's very different from any American national election of the past 20 years. The codes, the words of the religious right have largely been absent from the debates once we get outside the primary season and things like that. Now, do this for me, though. If you're listening to this series, remember these podcasts are free. I wanted everybody to have access to them out there during this election season, so I didn't put this behind the paywall at the end of history with the premium membership. This is largely because people in America are so stressed out in this country here in these final weeks before the election. I wanted them to see that there's an explanation for what's going on. Now, the only reason a Christian or a person of faith would be stressed out by what's taking place right now is because they're getting at their perspectives of lives, their perspective of the world from wrong sources. God's plans are good. This election's bad. It's real bad. But God is good and his plans are good. A lot of us need to really unlock from some incorrect paradigms and worldviews so we can see what God's actually doing. So we can see that more than really what the news is telling us. All right? Understanding how we got here, for me at least, helps unlock us from those bad perspectives, those bad or false perspectives that are kind of saturating our society right now. So saying that, I would ask that if you enjoy this podcast, if you enjoy the articles we're putting out at theendofhistory.net, please do me a favor and spread the word. If it's helpful to you, then it might be helpful to others. Share these episodes on Facebook and Twitter. Join the discussion by leaving comments at the website. Leave a positive review for us at iTunes. All those kinds of things are actually a lot more helpful than I think a lot of our listeners realize. So please support us by doing that. And of course, if you want to become a premium member to access some of the other exclusive content at the end of history, you're more than welcome and encouraged to do that. So I think that covers all of the background or the introductory stuff I wanted to get to during this episode. So I want to go ahead and jump into the story. Now, a lot of people begin to look at begin to look, I guess, of Christian politics in America all the way back to the beginning with the Pilgrims, and then there's the Founding Fathers. And I'm not going to do that in this series, and there's a couple of reasons why. First, there's a lot of debate as to how Christian America was before the rise of what's called the religious right today. Now, I personally grew up believing that America was founded as a Christian nation. There were all sorts of books and videos and a wealth of knowledge to support that basis, okay? I did a couple of years in Christian school, in private school. A lot of people out there have done that same thing. And if you did, then you were exposed to curriculums that encouraged that perspective. Deliberately, there was an agenda in place that encouraged that perspective. And I'm not saying it's wrong necessarily, but you've been exposed to that, and I'm aware of that. I read biographies, when I was young, I read biographies about famous Americans and their faith. There were history books. I remember one set of history books written by this man, Peter Marshall, and the books were called The Light and the Glory, and then there was a second volume, From Sea to Shining Sea. Now, Marshall, he was the son of a famous Senate chaplain who they made a movie about in the 1950s. I think it was called A Man Called Peter or something like that. His books told the story about the Christian history of America. And as far as I was concerned, still believe they were pretty good and well-documented books, but they did have an agenda. Okay, so, sometimes history gets a little tilted no matter which side you're looking at it if there's an agenda involved in the storytelling. Now, growing up, the idea that America might not be a Christian nation never really dawned on me. The thought didn't really even make sense. I mean, you see God referenced in so much of the early national documents and by the Founding Fathers. For example, if you read the farewell address of George Washington when he stepped down from being the first U.S. president, you see God, you see religion all over those words, all over that text of his speech. So yeah, there was separation of church and state, but that was written down from the perspective of these religious wars that so many of the religious immigrants were coming to America and escaping from. That was all going on in Europe. So separation of church and state was about the state can't tell me what to do as far as my religion's concerned. I'm free to worship as I want, and I want to worship Christ. And that was what Christian America was all about. They didn't want to turn off religion. They wanted to keep the state from keeping them from their own religion. That's the way I saw it, and what an overwhelming amount of Christian literature and teaching taught me as I was growing up. Now, modern historians do challenge that narrative today. Okay, they argue that America was distinctly non-Christian. It was a non-Christian nation as designed by the Founding Fathers. For example, the word God, the simple word of God, is nowhere in the U.S. Constitution. Now, while some, certainly not all, of the Founding Fathers and famous American leaders may have been men of faith, this perspective says they kept that deliberately. They kept that faith deliberately from their work in the government and in forming this new government. They didn't want a theocracy. That was the farthest thing from their mind. And today there's a big debate between these two camps. So that, like most things that are debated in America, one side is no longer listening to the other. To me personally, at this point in my development, at this point in my life, I guess I just don't really care if America was or was not founded as a Christian nation. And that's not an apathetic or complacent perspective. First of all, the lack of the mention of God in the Constitution doesn't really matter to me. Okay, that's not what kept it from establishing a Christian nation. All right, the fact that a black slave was ranked as 3/5 of a white man in the U.S. Constitution, that's what kept it from being a Christian document in my mind. The fact that a lot of America's progress in the 19th century was on the backs and the bloodshed and the loss of Native Americans or American Indians, that's what kept it from being a Christian nation. It really doesn't matter what the law says. It doesn't matter if the word God is not listed or is listed in the U.S. Constitution. Whether it was or not, reality said differently. They weren't behaving as Christians for sure. Jesus talked about those who hear and those who do the Word of God. There were two very different classifications for these groups of people in the Gospels and throughout the New Testament. There's a parable that Jesus told about this landowner. He went out to hire some laborers to work his field one day. And he went to one group, this first group, and they acted all eager to work, but then never went and actually did the work. He went to the second group, and they seemed totally disinterested in working for him, but they ended up going and doing it anyways. Now, Jesus pointed out that one of these groups actually obeyed, and the others just talked the talk. Well, to me, American history is full of a lot of people who talked the talk, but didn't walk the walk, as we say. So I don't really care if America was founded as a Christian nation or not. Now, the other reason I don't really care is because the laws of the United States and its history are not nearly as important to me as my personal faith and obedience to God. I don't need a Christian heritage to believe and know what the right thing to do today should be. A lot of those guys who signed the Constitution, a lot of those guys who talked about religious liberty, they maintained slaves like livestock. I don't need their endorsement to determine what's right and wrong. The primary law for my life isn't the Constitution. That's not the supreme law of the land in my perspective. But it's actually a much higher order than the Constitution, okay? The U.S. Constitution. So this isn't about America's Christian history, this podcast and this podcast series. Maybe someday we'll do a series on that. This series is about the modern Christian political history in America. And even if you're someone who believes that America was founded as a Christian nation, which is fine, or if you don't, which is also fine, the modern Christian political history is still very different from that national history. It's a lot more current. It's something we can actually trace its origins to right after World War II. Now, there were Christians and there were political movements before World War II, but they weren't anything like what we see today. I think it's safe to say. A lot of the stuff we even take for granted today, like the motto, "In God We Trust," that's printed on our money, or "One Nation Under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance, or even like things like the National Day of Prayer. All of that came after World War II. That's the seedlings, the early beginnings of the Christian right, or the Christian politicization of America. I think I said that word right. Things like every political candidate, even those we know are borderline pagans, saying "God bless America" at the end of their speeches, or "Pray for America," things like that, they just saturate our society today. And we take for granted how unique this stuff is from the America that existed before World War II. I remember, again, when I was a kid, this was in the 80s, when the culture wars were between the right and the left of American politics were really starting to heat up. I was young, but I really enjoyed learning about this stuff. My family was Christian, so I was, of course, heavily tilted toward the right side of the political spectrum, especially the Christian right. And I'm talking, Pat Robertson in 1988 and all of that kind of thing. My great-grandpa, on the other hand, he was this old logger. And in the 1920s, the 1930s, he didn't tell us the stories, but we would hear stories about how he had jumped trains all over the South, traveling around during the Great Depression in those times, looking for work. And so he was a lifelong Democrat. And I couldn't figure that out. I couldn't reconcile that with my perspectives of politics and the world as a teenager, at least. He was a Christian too. He was a good man. And so how could he be for this party that was, and again, the key issue, how could he be for this party that was pro-abortion in the 1980s? How could he tolerate a liberal political party? So I asked him about it. Now he's a man of very few words, or he was a man of very few words, and he certainly didn't talk politics with the words that he did take the time to utter. He just said he had been Democrat since Roosevelt, talking about FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So I asked, how could you, and we call him Papa Lewis, how could you be for the Democrats, though? They're liberals, they're pro-abortion. And when I would ask him that, and I only did it once, but when I asked him that, he just sat calm and kind of stone-faced like he always did. And then in his old voice, he calmly recalled the logic that had guided him for over half a century when he came to politics. He said, when Roosevelt was president, we had food and jobs. When he wasn't, we didn't. Now, I didn't get that at the time, but he was telling me it was different in his day. It wasn't about morals and religion. It was about common sense. And he didn't change with the times. His political logic and rationale, they held to 1932, and they never really moved all the way to the day that he died. It was different back then. And it's hard for us to realize how non-polarized, non-religious it was during his time as a young man. These were issues of policy at best, not issues of religion, not issues of morality, but issues, or even issues of the heart, really. These were issues about how are we going to eat during his day. Now, there were religious figures in politics, but they were standouts. Most Americans didn't expect their political leaders to be Christian or religious, or at least not talk about it. In fact, in the East, during the early part of the 20th century and the latter part of the 19th century, politics was really considered a pretty rough game. It was something that dignified or honorable people on the norm, they didn't do that for a career. Politics was notorious for cronyism, for corruption, and with good reason. It was all of those things. If you've watched any of those Ken Burns documentaries about Teddy Roosevelt, you see that. I guess it's about Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt. You see that government leaders at that time in the East, they were selected in the back rooms of bars, amongst cigar smoking power brokers. The vote in the ballot box, that was all just a technicality at that point in American history. Well, ironically, the places where you would occasionally find Christians active in politics were in the areas that we would call liberal by today's standards. Back then, around the turn of the century and into the interwar years between World War I and World War II, liberals were called progressives. They were the guys who believed it was the government's job to take better care of the people, especially the poor, especially the weak and the downtrodden. Now, not all of the progressives were religious. Most of them weren't. But when you found a Christian in politics during that time period, more likely than not, he was going to be a progressive more than anything else. He or she was involved in politics on the basis of ideals, and those ideals were easy to link with their faith. William Jennings Bryan was one of the most famous of these. Now, he was a senator from Nebraska and ran for president 3 times over the course of his career. He's anti-imperialism. He's pro-prohibition, which means outlawing alcohol drink. He was anti-elitist. He was fired up by his ideals. And I'm saying ideals, not ideas, all right? The things he held dear, the vision of what we should be living like, right? He was fired up by those things. He was a leader of the Democratic Party for a really long time. In fact, he was most famous for his speeches, and in a day when most politicking, running for office, things like that, took place through the newspaper, Jennings Bryan, he was one of the first that traveled all over the place, delivering speeches and firing crowds up for what he believed was the right and moral duty of the government to do. When Woodrow Wilson became president in 1912, this was after Jennings Bryan had failed several times to become president himself. Woodrow Wilson became president in 1912. He made Jennings Bryan his Secretary of State. Now, Jennings Bryan, as Secretary of State, now that's the role that Hillary Clinton has just stepped out of. All right, John Kerry is now operating in. You've had different important, significant figures in this role. Jennings Bryan, when he became Secretary of State, he had this statue on his desk of swords turned into plowshares. And it's the whole idea of the statue was taken from the verse in Isaiah 2 that speaks to a day of world peace. These are his ideals that he modeled from his office and position as Secretary of State. Isaiah 2 speaks to a day of world peace when the nations will, and this is quoting from Isaiah 2, beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. That was the vision. That was the ideal that William Jennings Bryan had for his time as Secretary of State. It was kind of the wrong time to be the guy in favor of world peace and a pacifist at all, though. So it was kind of a bad time of history for William Jennings Bryan. When World War I broke out, Jennings Bryan was more or less booted out of office because he just refused to go along with the idea of war. He was a man of principle. In 1915, the Germans, they sank this boat, the Lusitania, and this served as a big impetus for America getting into the war at that time. Jennings Bryan, he goes to the president and he complains to Woodrow Wilson that we shouldn't be so upset about the drowning of so few people when there were whole nations out there starving in the world at that time. Now, his logic kind of makes sense right there. It may have been sound, but his idealism didn't really fit with the nationalism that was going on in the war, in the America and its march to war in 1915. It's kind of ironic, but at the time of World War I, most of the Christians who we would call evangelicals or fundamentalists today, they were actually very much not pro-America at that time. They weren't necessarily anti-American, but the World War really kind of freaked them out. They thought this was the end times apocalypse coming on the earth, and they were concerned that President Wilson was going to unintentionally link America up with the Antichrist, who everybody was convinced was going to come out of Europe, right? So they pushed hard for Americans to stay out of the war, and even harder for Americans not to fight in that war. The idea of killing people, it didn't line up with some of the basic doctrines of Christianity. They pushed pretty hard for Christians to stay out of the fight, and they were really influential in that push. A couple of decades later, when America was going back to war in the Second World War, there was a movie that came out with Gary Cooper, and it was made to actually combat this Christian philosophy that had been so dominant during World War I. And it's about this Christian hero from World War I, Sergeant York, true story. And the makers of this movie, Sergeant York, they wanted to show how Christians should fight in the war that was coming, World War II, and not be a pacifist or conscientious objector. This is a scene, part of the overall message that Sergeant York was contributing to the dialogue during this time.
You see, I believe in the Bible, and I'm a believing that this here life we're living is something the Lord done give us, and we got to be a living it the best we can. And I'm figuring that killing other folks ain't no part of what he was intending for us to be a doing here.
Well, yes, in a way, I agree with you.
York, with your permission, Major.
Certainly, Captain. Sit down, York.
You say you believe in the Bible.
Yes, sir.
Well, I do too. But do you believe that the Bible means that a man shouldn't fight for what he believes to be right?
Well, it done said, blessed are the peacemakers.
Yes, I know, but you remember that verse, I think it's in Luke, where he says, "He that hath no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one"?
He said that to Peter. But he done stop Peter from using the sword. He said, them that lives by the sword will be a perishing by the sword. That further on.
Yes, I remember, but...
Now, go ahead, Captain. Go ahead.
But according to St. John, he said, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servant fight.
Well, that's just the point, Captain. He done said his kingdom were not of this world. And that is different.
Yes, but...
Just a moment, Captain. York, have you ever read this?
History of the United States. Yeah, sure a lot of writing. Daniel Boone.
Yeah. You know about him?
Well, everybody down there knows about Daniel Boone, the first man into the Valley of the Three Forks.
Yeah, he was quite a man. One of the greatest. And that book's full of great men. York, what do you suppose that Boone was looking for when he went out alone into the wilderness?
Well, I never thought much on it.
Was he looking for new lands?
Might be.
Maybe. Maybe for something more. Something that a man just can't see with his eyes or hold in his hands. Something that some men don't even know they have until they've lost it.
Yes, sir.
To be free. You know, that's quite a word, freedom. I think that's what he wanted. I think that's what sent Boone into your Tennessee country.
Is that what this here book's about?
Yep. That's the story of a whole people's struggle for freedom. From the very beginning until now. For we're still struggling. It's quite a story, York. How they all got together and set up a government whereby all men were pledged to defend the rights of each man, and each man to defend the rights of all men. We call it a government of the people, by the people, and for the people.
Well, I never knowed it was all written down.
You're a religious man, York.
Yes, sir.
You want to worship God in your own way.
Yes, sir.
You're a farmer.
Yes, sir.
You want to plow your fields as you see fit and raise your family according to your own lights. And that's your heritage. And mine. Every American's. But the cost of that heritage is high. Sometimes it takes all we have to preserve it. Even our lives. How are you going to answer that, York?
Wow. You done give me a powerful lot to be a-thinking about.
Well, in any event, the feelings of Christians had changed by World War II. We'll get back to that. Back to William Jennings Bryan, though. After leaving the Secretary of State, he became this big proponent of prohibition, believing it would make families stronger. All right. If fathers weren't leaving work to go drink, but instead coming home to raise their kids, families were going to be better off. And this was part of his Christian paradigm, his Christian perspectives of the world that he really believed in. One of his more famous things was near the end of his life, and that's become the stories of, I guess, legends and myth among many historians. The famous Scopes monkey trial, if you've ever heard of that. It took place in Tennessee in 1925. Now, this famous trial was taking place because a teacher had taught evolution at a school in a small southern town, even though it was against the state law at that time to teach that man had evolved from apes, from a lower life form. Well, Jennings Bryan, he shows up, and he's the lawyer in the trial, arguing that this law is good, this guy should be convicted, this teacher should, and he defends the law, used all sorts of scripture to combat evolution. Well, he won the trial because the trial was obviously a little bit biased. The jury was a bit biased towards him and his perspectives at that time. He won the trial. It's eventually overturned at the Supreme Court. The sad part was the legacy this left to Jennings Bryan. This guy's an idealist who had fought for the weak and for what he believed was the moral good all his life. And he's ridiculed in the media during that time as this, they paint him to be this backward Southern hick. Later, there's a famous play and a movie called Inherit the Wind, based on the Scopes trial. And it painted Williams Jennings Bryan as this simpleton who's just completely overwhelmed when his Bible beliefs were confronted with science. Well, Williams Jennings Bryan would have fit in with a lot of the modern perspectives of what we call the religious right today. But he would have been a liberal Democrat in a lot of the other ways. This is what most politicians who held to strong religious beliefs were like during the pre-World War II time period. Another one along these lines was Jane Addams. I don't know if you've ever heard of her. She was one of those, the most prominent reformers of the progressive era. Fascinating history. If you've never learned about Jane Addams, you should go research her. Her big causes were women's suffrage, the right to vote, and social work. So in a time when society is still trying to figure out how to handle the massive urbanization that had been brought about by the Industrial Revolution, Addams steps in, and with what she called Christian humanitarianism. Now, a lot of the social safety nets that we take for granted today were actually implemented and designed by Jane Addams. The most famous of these was this thing called Hull House, which was based in inner city Chicago. Jane Addams and her group, they turned this rundown mansion there in inner city Chicago into a capital for social welfare and reform. There were clubs for children, food kitchens for the poor, research, night classes, medical clinics, and a whole lot of stuff that were all based out of the Hull House. So each week, about 2,000 people went through the Hull House. And Jane Addams became the first woman to win the Nobel Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931, I think, and is recognized as the founder of social work here in the United States. Now, Addams, she looked to her Christian faith as the central driver of this massive work she was doing, and all of this would have fit easily into what former President George W. Bush described as faith-based organizations or faith-based initiatives. These were Christian organizations looking to cure the ills of society, and one of the best ideas promoted in the modern era by the Christian right, this faith-based organization, faith-based initiatives. But Jane Addams was also one of the co-founders of the American Civil Liberties Union, one of the great enemies of the modern Christian right today. She wasn't a politician, probably only because women weren't allowed to be politicians in America at that time period, but she invented and pushed public and social policy probably greater and more prolifically than anyone prior to the New Deal with Franklin Roosevelt and the Great Depression. So there were Christians involved in politics and public policy before World War II, but they were idealists. One of the key things that sticks out to me when I compare folks like Jane Addams and William Jennings Bryan to modern-day religious right leaders is how they operated. Jennings Bryan and Addams were driven by their faith and ideals to change society. And a lot of people in the modern religious right today are like that or were like that, but then it seemed to change to where it was more about changing the shape of society to fit their faith and ideals. If you can follow that logic, how that works, it went from being focused on the faith and ideals to changing society to fit the faith and ideals. And hopefully that will make more sense as we go along. When for example, when we look at the judge in Alabama who fought all the way to the Supreme Court to get a statue of the Ten Commandments posted in front of his courthouse, it really doesn't fit with this early idea of Christian politics. He obviously had ideals that were driving him to do this, but when you back away from it, what good were they? It seemed, or at least it seemed to me, that most of it was more about making a point. How was society really being aided there? Yeah, you can say, well, society needs to know what's right and wrong. That's great, but people who are suffering don't really care about what's right and wrong at the time. People who are poor and in poverty, I mean, that's not the top priority for them. There was an old, I guess it was in the Onion magazine. It was an article, and I don't remember what the article said, but I just remember the headline, and it was in some place where there was massive starvation, massive famine going on, maybe Somalia or something like that. And it says, thousands of starving Somalians eager to receive new Bibles from Christian charities. And it's like, yeah, it's a good idea, but what does that really do to help their immediate needs, help their immediate problems? The early progressives, the early Christian political progressives, they were focused on those needs, how to help, how to benefit life, how to improve the quality of life, right? The old school guys like Jennings, Bryan, and Adams, they seem to operate more along the lines of getting the commandments of the Ten Commandments, of the commandments of righteousness, be written on their hearts. They didn't have to make a point. They had to help people and make the world a better place. That's what they were focused on. So there were Christian politics prior to World War II, but they weren't really organized like what we know as the religious right today. And I guess that's wrong. They were organized, but it was around their values and their principles, not their politics. And that was going to come, though. And in the next episode, we're going to look at how Christians or religious right began to organize as politically against communism. And slowly but surely, this began to be a Republican movement. That will come in this second episode, releasing in 2 days from now.
Thanks for listening to The End of History with J.B. Shreve. Check out more episodes at iTunes and wherever you download quality podcasts. Join us online at theendofhistory.net for articles and essays from the end of history. Follow JB on Twitter at JB_Shreve. The End of History is produced by Windmill Media.